Next, we're going to look at how we can use factoring to solve equations that we didn't previously know how to solve. First, let's take a look at these equations. And we've got something missing. You'll notice that all of them have a blank value that we're trying to figure out what would go there. And all of these equations end up being equal to 0 after you multiply something. So if you ask yourself, how do I multiply two things together and get an answer of 0, you should be able to come up with the answer that the only way to do that is if one of those things is 0. So for example, 7 times 0 is 0. 11 times 0 is 0. X times 0 is 0. 0 times 0 is 0. But you can't have something like 7 times 2 and get 0. The only way to have a multiplication problem and end up with an answer of 0 is if at least one of the things that you are multiplying is 0. Now that actually has a name. It's called the zero product property. And once we have our equations factored, we're going to have a multiplication problem. So if the other side of that equation happens to be 0, and we can manipulate the equation so that it does end up working that way, then we know that one of those factors has to be 0, and we can take each of the individual factors, set them equal to 0, and solve. So our steps to being able to solve a quadratic by using the zero product property is that first we're going to rearrange the equation in standard form. So that means the left-hand side should be ax squared plus bx plus c, and then the other side should be equals 0. After that, we're going to factor the left-hand side. Right now we only know how to factor one way with GCFs, but later we'll have other ways to factor as well. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set each of the factors on the left-hand side of that equation equal to 0 and solve all of them. And however many factors there are, each of those leads to an answer. So let's look at a few examples here. So this first one on the left, negative 2x squared plus 4x equals 0. The first step is to write it in standard form. This one's already done. The second step is to factor. So at this point, the only way I know how to factor is to take out a GCF, negative 2x squared and 4x. If we start with the numerical part, the GCF is negative 2. Remember, if the first term's negative, we want to take out a negative, and 2 and 4 are both divisible by 2. Then we want to look at x's. The first term has an x squared, the second term has an x to the first. They both have at least one power of x. Then I set up a set of parentheses, and I do the opposite of distributing to figure out what goes in the parentheses. So I ask myself, negative 2x times what is negative 2x squared? And that would be x. And then I ask myself, negative 2x times what equals 4x? And that would be negative 2. So here's the new step. Now that I have the left-hand side factored, I'm going to take each of the factors and set them equal to 0. Remember that a factor is something that's multiplied together. So the things that are being multiplied together here are the negative 2x and the x minus 2. So I'm taking both of those factors and setting them equal to 0, and now I'm going to solve them both using inverse operations. On the left, I end up with 0. On the right, I end up with 2. So my solutions are x equals 0 or x equals 2. Let's take a look at the second question here. We have 3x squared equals 12x. Now that one's not in standard form because it's not something equals 0. So my first step would be to subtract 12x from both sides so that I can make the right-hand side of the equation be equal to 0. And then on my left-hand side, those are not like terms, so I can't put them together. It's just 3x squared minus 12x. Next, I'm looking for a GCF. 3 and 12 are both divisible by 3. X squared and x are both divisible by x. Now I do the opposite of distributing. I ask myself, 3x times what is 3x squared? 3x times x is 3x squared. I ask myself, 3x times what is negative 12x? 3x times negative 4 is negative 12x. Now here's my new step. I am going to take both of the factors and set them equal to 0. So either 3x equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. On the left-hand side, I'm going to divide both sides by 3 and get x equals 0. On the right-hand side, I'm going to add 4 to get x equals 4. So my two solutions are x equals 0 or x equals 4. Now, you won't always end up with two solutions, but if you look at your degree of the polynomial, that will tell you how many solutions you should end up with. So for example, if there was an x cubed as the highest exponent, then you would end up with 3 answers. That's just kind of a quick way to make sure that you've gotten enough solutions.